Welcome to Reform Thinking. So, I want you to imagine for a second that you are trapped in a burning building.
Okay. Not a great place to be.
No, not at all. The smoke is blinding, you literally can't breathe, and the floor is giving way right beneath you. And then suddenly, a firefighter kicks down the door.
Oh, thank goodness.
Right. He throws you over his shoulder, and he drags you out onto the street. And you just collapse on the pavement, gasping for air, completely overwhelmed by the sheer relief of just being alive.
Which is the natural reaction, right? You just survived a disaster.
Exactly.
Right.
But before you can even catch your breath, the firefighter leans down, shoves this heavy canvas hose into your hands, and says, "Hey, your rescue is only half the miracle. Put on this helmet and get back in there."
Wow. Yeah, that completely shatters our modern, comfortable paradigm of what it actually means to be rescued.
It really does. Because we naturally view salvation as, like, the finish line.
We do. We just want to sit on the curb and be grateful we survived the fire. We don't want to go back in.
And that profound, honestly jarring pivot from being the rescued to suddenly becoming the rescuer is really the beating heart of our deep dive today.
It's such a fascinating topic, too.
It is. We are looking at a classic piece of historical theology from the legendary 19th century London preacher Charles Haddon Spurgeon. Specifically, we're diving into a section of his work called The Soul Winner, under the heading Instruction in Soul Winning.
And his entire thesis in this text hinges on one of the most famous, yet maybe most misunderstood single verses in the Gospel of Matthew.
Right, Matthew 4:19, where Jesus is looking at a couple of rough working-class guys and says, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men."
Spurgeon takes that one sentence, just that one line, and he unfurls it into this comprehensive, demanding, yet I think deeply comforting blueprint for sharing your faith.
The mission for our deep dive today is to really unpack that blueprint. Because, to your point about the burning building, Spurgeon's central argument is a paradox that a lot of people really struggle with.
Yeah, he insists that being caught in the gospel net, being saved from the dark waters of sin, is really only the first phase of the divine operation.
Which is a lot to process.
It is, because he says the much more astounding miracle, like the higher supernatural act, is transforming the fish that was just caught into a fisherman.
And he doesn't just lay this out as some dry academic treatise either. To get this point across, Spurgeon leans into some of the most vivid, visceral, historical metaphors you can honestly imagine.
He was a master of imagery, for sure.
Oh, completely. So today, we are going to examine the frantic, drum-beating fishermen of the Mediterranean coast. We'll talk about the tragic theological extinction of the dodo bird.
Which is just a brilliant analogy, by the way.
So good. And by the end, we'll uncover why Spurgeon was absolutely convinced that the most effective gamekeepers on the king's estate are actually the reclaimed poachers.
It's a remarkable journey. And logically, he starts at the absolute ground zero of the believer's experience, which is the raw material of the person being called.
Right, because I think the initial instinct, when faced with a command like, "Go be a fisher of men," is just intense imposter syndrome.
Oh, 100%. You look at your own life and think, I am vastly unqualified for this. I can barely keep my own life together.
Exactly. But Spurgeon addresses that head on. He argues that when Christ issues this call, the focus is entirely stripped away from human merit. The command is not, "Follow me because of what you already are."
No, it's entirely about what the master can forge you into, which is deeply consistent with a really robust view of grace.
Break that down a bit for us.
Well, Spurgeon looks at those original disciples, Peter, Andrew, James, John. These were lowly Galilean peasants. They were intimately familiar with the dragnet. They knew the smell of the sea. They knew how to mend coarse rope.
But they were definitely not the educated philosophical elite of their day.
Right. If a first-century sociologist looked at those men and said, "Ah, yes, these are the intellects who will conquer the Roman Empire and found global churches," they would have been laughed out of the room.
And Spurgeon draws this magnificent parallel to the creation of the world in Genesis 1 to highlight this. He points out that when God spoke the cosmos into existence, he didn't start with a pristine, organized canvas.
He started with absolute chaos.
Chaos, darkness, a formless void. And with the simple fiat, "Let there be light," God brought unimaginable beauty and order out of that original ruin.
And Spurgeon says God does the exact same thing with the human soul.
Yeah. The chaos of our past, our lack of theological refinement, our deep moral failings, those aren't barriers to the call. They're actually the raw material for the first miracle.
The mechanics of that creation analogy are just so vital here. Because just as the chaotic void in Genesis couldn't, organize itself into the Garden of Eden by its own sheer willpower.
Right, it needed an outside force.
Exactly. A person who is spiritually dead or morally adrift cannot suddenly organize themselves into a saint. It requires a sovereign creative act from the outside.
But once that light is spoken into existence, the whole purpose of that light is to shine on others.
And this is where he makes that hard pivot we talked about in the intro.
Yeah, he says, we are like fish who made sin our natural element. We swam in it, we breathed it, and the gospel net drags us out of that deadly element.
But then he says, and this is a direct quote, "It is another and a higher miracle to make us who were fish to become fishers."
To make the convert into the converter. He actually goes so far as to say that if you aren't bringing others in, the work is only half done. You are only half formed in the image of your Lord.
That phrase, half formed, is so striking.
It is, and I want to press into this a little bit because as much as I appreciate the grandeur of the creation analogy, this half-formed language can sound incredibly heavy to a listener.
I can see how it would, yeah.
Because from a theological standpoint, we talk so much about resting in the finished work of Christ, right? We talk about grace being a free gift, not a wage we earn.
Right.
So if I tell a bruised, exhausted person who just barely found their footing in the faith that their salvation is only half the miracle, and now they owe the master a quota of caught fish, doesn't that fundamentally wreck the doctrine of rest?
That's a really valid question.
I mean, are we just immediately drafted into a spiritual labor camp the moment we're saved?
That is a very sharp pushback, and it really gets to the core of how we understand our own nature post-conversion.
Okay, unpack that for me.
If you view the command to fish as this external arbitrary task that's just layered on top of your existing identity, then yes, it feels like an unbearable burden. It feels like a labor camp.
Right, like a chore you have to do to pay off a debt.
Exactly. But Spurgeon is getting at something far deeper here. He is talking about an ontological change, a change in the very fabric of your being.
What does that ontological shift actually look like in practice, though, like on a Tuesday morning?
Think about the nature of Christ himself. The essence of the Christ life is rescue. It is a heart that looks at a harassed and helpless crowd and feels deep, active compassion.
So it's about mirroring his heart.
Yeah. Spurgeon is arguing that if the Spirit of Christ has genuinely taken up residence inside of you, that same instinct is going to organically grow. It's not that management handed you a clipboard and a quota, it's that your new nature inherently desires what the Master desires.
Oh, yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
So when he says you are half-formed, he isn't questioning your justification or your salvation. He's saying the seed of this new life hasn't fully blossomed yet. A fish doesn't want to catch other fish. But a fisherman does.
The burden only feels heavy if you're still trying to operate with the instincts of the fish.
Precisely. The labor is the outflow of the new identity, not the purchase price of it.
That distinction makes a world of difference for how you read this.
Yeah.
But I think we also have to contextualize the sheer urgency that is just pulsing through this text. Spurgeon is not suggesting soul winning as a quaint hobby for spiritual overachievers.
Not at all.
He uses incredibly dark, ominous language. He talks about the day being very dark. He sees the heavens lowering with heavy thunderclouds. And he even talks about the potential breaking up of society.
Well, we really have to remember where and when he is standing when he's delivering this. This is in 19th century London.
Right, the heart of the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah. He is pastoring through massive industrial upheaval, horrific poverty, rampant disease, like terrible cholera outbreaks, and what he perceived as a terrifying theological downgrade in the surrounding churches.
It was a very turbulent time.
But he's also speaking to the universal human condition. He looks out at the city and sees eternal stakes. He genuinely believes that people are perishing, which means every single believer is desperately needed on the line.
He writes that even if you consider yourself nothing more than a glowworm, you have an absolute obligation to show your spark.
I love that glowworm imagery.
Me too. He says, even if you were just the tiniest farthing candle, you cannot hide under a bushel. And I think about the psychology of that. So often, people excuse themselves from ministry because they compare their little farthing candle to Spurgeon's blazing lighthouse.
Oh, totally. They think, I don't have a theology degree, I can't speak in public, what use am I?
Exactly. And Spurgeon's answer is, you are of immense use in the dark corner where you've been placed.
In fact, to refuse to shine in that corner leads to what he considers a terrifying tragedy. He brings up the biblical figure of Lot living in Sodom as the ultimate cautionary tale.
Yes, his treatment of Lot is just scathing. He calls him a poor creature and a wretched kind of believer.
Which are harsh words.
Very harsh. He points out that, yes, Lot was technically saved. He was dragged out of the city before the fire fell, but he was a complete failure as a fisher of men.
He didn't have any influence.
None. He didn't even have enough spiritual authority to convince his own sons-in-law to leave with him. They literally thought he was joking. Lot's life offered no light, no restraint on the culture, no rescue for his neighbors.
And that psychological reality of being a wretched believer is what Spurgeon is desperately trying to spare his congregation from.
To be technically secure, but practically barren.
Exactly. To cross the finish line smelling like smoke with absolutely nothing to show for the grace you received. For Spurgeon, a faith that doesn't propagate itself is a stunted, sorrowful existence.
So if the stakes are that high, and ending up like Lot is the great tragedy we must avoid at all costs, what is the actual training manual? Because Spurgeon must have had a method, right?
Well,
How does a glowworm learn to fish?
he absolutely has a method.
And this brings us to a part of the text that I found deeply disruptive to our modern sensibilities. Because Spurgeon actively mocks the typical answers of his day and ours, quite frankly.
He really goes after the institutional approach.
He does. He asked rhetorically, what is the way to become an efficient preacher? And then he just swats away the professionalized model of ministry. He says, go to college or attend a training class.
With dripping sarcasm.
Total sarcasm. Now, he concedes those academic pursuits might be fine in their proper place, but he insists they are utterly secondary. The exclusive process, the foundational prerequisite for learning the trade, is found entirely in those two words. Follow me.
He calls Jesus the dictator of the rule. The logic is so simple for him. If you want to be useful, you keep in his track.
But he doesn't leave following as some vague, mystical concept. He breaks it down into some highly stringent, very uncomfortable subpoints.
Starting with the absolute necessity of separation.
Yes, and when he talks about separation, he brings out the rhetorical heavy artillery. He states categorically, fish will not be fishers. The sinner will not convert the sinner.
It makes sense when you think about the physics of it.
Right? He says the worldly Christian will not convert the world. He essentially says you cannot stay in the same moral or spiritual element as the people you're trying to catch.
And then he takes aim right at Christians who try to dabble in the amusements and vices of the world just to appear relevant.
Oh, the language he uses here is wild. He calls it hungering after dog's meat, eating garbage, and he compares a compromised church to putrefying salt.
It is visceral language, designed to shock the conscience. He invokes the historical weight of the Puritan forefathers, men who would have rather rotted in prison or died at the stake than tolerate the worldly compromises that Spurgeon saw creeping into the 19th century church.
He is arguing for a radical, unmistakable distinction between the kingdom of light and the kingdom of darkness.
He is.
Okay, but I have to push back here because this creates a massive practical tension. Let's think about learning a physical trade, like master carpentry. You don't learn how to build a house by sitting in an ivory tower reading a textbook about wood. You have to be in the workshop. You have to smell the sawdust, watch the master's hands, see how he handles the grain, and mimic his posture.
You're true. You have to be hands-on.
Right. So if we apply this to the fishing metaphor, if we separate ourselves as severely as Spurgeon seems to be demanding, if we are terrified of the dog's meat of the world and refuse to get into the water, how do we ever reach the fish?
That's the million-dollar question.
If we pull too far away into our wholly sterilized huddles, singing 17th century hymns and isolating ourselves from the culture, how does Spurgeon reconcile this massive gulf? Because total separation usually leads to total irrelevance.
That is the exact tension every believer has to navigate, and Spurgeon's nuance here is really critical.
Yeah.
Because he's absolutely not advocating for monasticism.
He's not telling people to move to a convent.
No, in fact, he explicitly writes, "We are not called to leave our daily business or to quit our families. To withdraw from the marketplace or the public square would be, in his words, running away from the fishery entirely."
So you have to be at the sea. But how do you stay out of the water?
The separation he demands is moral and spiritual, not physical or geographical. And he uses the ultimate example to prove his point, Jesus Christ himself.
Okay, how so?
Well, Spurgeon points out that Jesus mixed with sinners more intimately than any Pharisee would ever dare. He ate with tax collectors, he spoke with prostitutes, he touched lepers.
He was constantly in the mess of humanity.
Exactly. And this is the key mechanism. He did it like a physician healing his patients.
That physician analogy is brilliant. Let's pull that apart a bit. Because if a doctor is trying to stop an outbreak, they don't hide in their basement.
Right, they go to the hospital.
They walk straight into the infectious disease ward, right to the epicenter of the sickness. But they wear PPE. They maintain a strict, clinical, hygienic separation. They don't start licking the doorknobs to relate to the patients.
That would be a terrible doctor.
Right, because if the doctor catches the disease, they completely lose their ability to help the patient.
Precisely. It's the mechanics of spiritual contagion versus spiritual immunity. Spurgeon is saying that if the Christian adopts the exact moral diseases of the culture, the greed, the triviality, the cutthroat ambition, the casual dishonesty, they lose all power to cure it.
They just become another patient.
Exactly. If the salt loses its distinct chemical makeup, it doesn't preserve the meat, it just becomes part of the rot. The prerequisite for usefulness is maintaining your distinct flavor while you are fully immersed in the world, so you actually have an alternative reality to offer.
That makes total sense. So separation is sort of the defensive posture.
Yeah.
But what is the offensive posture? How do you actually learn the trade?
This leads to a second subpoint of following, which is abiding in apprenticeship.
Right. Following isn't just about what you avoid. It's about who you attach yourself to. He says to learn the art and mystery of soul winning, one must live with the master.
And he brings up a really beautiful piece of church history here, referencing the Vaudois pastors.
The Waldensians, these are the pre-Reformation believers living up in the Alps, surviving centuries of intense persecution.
Exactly. And the way they preserved their faith and trained their leaders wasn't primarily through massive seminaries. Spurgeon notes their practice where the older, seasoned men would take the young men up the mountainside.
Like a mentorship.
Yes, but deeply immersive. The younger men lived in the house with them. They watched them prepare. They heard them pray in secret. They walked with them to preach. It was a life-on-life apprenticeship.
The character of the older man was transferred to the younger man through sheer proximity. It's discipleship through osmosis.
But Spurgeon quickly notes that the original 12 disciples had an even better tutor in Jesus. They were his familiar friends.
They saw his secret agonies in the garden. They marked his compassion for the crowds. They felt the intensity of his prayers. They didn't just learn a syllabus. They caught his spirit.
Think about the mechanics of how human beings actually learn. We are mimetic creatures. We imitate what we consistently observe.
Right, we mirror the people we spend time with.
If you want to know how to navigate the complex, messy business of saving men, you have to watch how the Savior does it. And that requires a level of daily, abiding intimacy that goes way beyond a superficial Sunday morning attendance.
In an era that prizes shortcuts and five-step life hacks, Spurgeon insists there is no hack for spiritual power. It is forged in the slow, unseen hours of abiding with Christ.
Which brings us to the actual message the fisherman is supposed to carry.
Oh boy.
And this is where Spurgeon gets fiercely protective, issuing a severe warning against what he calls the brand new thought.
Because following Jesus isn't just about absorbing his character. It requires an unyielding alignment with his actual unedited message.
He demands total obedience to the inherited truth. He issues the scathing critique of the public teachers of his day who felt the need to innovate on the gospel.
You can practically hear the sarcasm dripping from his pen when he describes the boastful method of the modern theologian.
He paints such a specific picture.
He mocks the guy who says, I am not going to preach this old gospel, this musty Puritan doctrine. I will sit down in my study and burn the midnight oil and invent a new theory. Then I will come out with my brand new thought and blaze away with it.
He really had no patience for that.
None at all. Spurgeon views that kind of intellectual originality not as genius, but as sheer treason.
And we should provide some historical context here to honor the impartiality of our deep dive. Spurgeon is referencing specific theological battles of the late 19th century.
Right, the downgrade controversy and all that.
Exactly. He explicitly calls out those who were softening the doctrine of eternal punishment, trying to preach what he calls a little hell. He also critiques those embracing early theories of evolution that he felt contradicted Genesis, and those who are generally allowing the sharp edges of the historical gospel to erode.
And we need to explicitly remind you, the listener, that our goal today isn't to litigate the science of evolution or the modern debates on hell. We aren't endorsing or taking sides on these culturally and theologically sensitive topics. We are just trying to accurately report the historical author's unvarnished worldview.
And in his worldview, altering the message to suit the genius of the age was a catastrophic error.
He claims that in the hands of these innovative thinkers, the true gospel is as clean gone as the dodo from its old haunts.
The dodo bird gospel.
I love that so much. A flightless, extinct bird. The preachers still hold the title of Christ's ministers, but the actual power to save has gone extinct in their pulpits.
It's a tragic image.
It is. But I want to push back on Spurgeon's sheer hostility toward new thoughts here, because cultural translation is a real biblical necessity.
Okay, give me an example.
Think about a jazz cover band taking a classical Mozart piece. They might change the tempo, use different instruments, and add some swing, but they are doing it so a modern audience can actually feel the music.
Right, they're translating the vibe.
Yeah. If you preach 17th century Puritanism to a 21st century tech worker, they don't even hear the music. It's a foreign language. Paul the Apostle quoted pagan poets in Athens to contextualize the message.
That's true, he did.
So why is Spurgeon so utterly convinced that being a servile copyist is the only way? Doesn't the bait have to change depending on the fish you were trying to catch?
That is the perennial debate, right?
Yeah.
Cultural contextualization versus theological dilution. But to understand Spurgeon's rigidity here, we have to look at his underlying theology of causality.
What do you mean by causality?
He does not view the gospel as a human philosophy that can be tweaked, improved, or updated to match the prevailing scientific or sociological mood. He views the gospel strictly as a divine remedy.
Like a specific synthesized medicine for a highly specific disease.
Yes. If you have a deadly terminal virus and the chief physician prescribes a highly potent specific chemical cure, you do not want the local pharmacist to get creative and invent a brand new thought for your prescription.
Oh, definitely not. You want the exact formula.
You want the pharmacist to be a servile copyist of the doctor's exact formula. Spurgeon draws a direct causal line between the looseness of the age, the increasing vice and moral decay he saw in society, and the laxity of the doctrine being preached.
Ah, I see the mechanics of it now. If the preacher pares down the bad news, if they teach that sin is just a minor flaw and hell is just a metaphor, then the divine remedy, the bloody cross of Christ, seems like an absurd overreaction.
Exactly. You don't need chemotherapy for a paper cut.
Wow. That makes so much sense. If you dilute the disease, the cure loses all its power.
For Spurgeon, spiritual power is inextricably linked to strict, faithful repetition of the original message, paired with what he calls living orthodoxy.
Living orthodoxy,
Yeah.
meaning it's not just intellectual repetition. You must reproduce Christ's holiness in your life.
Because a hypocritical life renders the best theology contemptible. But if you walk in the footprints of his pierced feet and deliver his message unedited, then you will have power.
This all sounds incredibly demanding. I mean, maintain radical moral separation, abide daily in deep spiritual intimacy, and preach an unyielding, unpopular message. The burden on the human instrument just feels crushing.
It does. But Spurgeon brilliantly shifts the weight of this entire enterprise back onto the sovereign machinery of God, focusing on the second half of the verse. I will make you.
From me is thy fruit found. This is where Spurgeon's deep Reformed theology provides massive comfort. He is arguing that human effort, no matter how strenuous, how perfectly obedient, or how separated, cannot independently generate spiritual life.
We can hold the net, but we cannot force the fish into it. God is the primary effectual actor.
And what blew my mind in this section is how intensely personal Spurgeon gets to illustrate this point. He argues that God uses the entirety of our messy, painful human experiences as the actual machinery to forge us into fishermen.
He uses himself as the prime example, which, for the Prince of Preachers standing in the Metropolitan Tabernacle, must have been a stunning moment of vulnerability.
To admit to his congregation his struggles with fearful depression of spirits. He talks about standing on the horrible brink of the gulf of darkness.
We know historically that Spurgeon suffered terribly from gout, physical pain, and deep, crushing bouts of melancholy. But notice the theological framework he applies to his depression.
Right, he doesn't view it as a failure of his faith, a random biological accident, or a punishment.
No, he views it as the specific crucible God used to equip him.
Let's break down the psychology of that for a second. How does depression practically equip a preacher?
It creates empathy and a shared vocabulary of suffering. Spurgeon says that because he had been in that terrifying gulf of darkness, he knew exactly how the rocks felt.
Wow.
So when he encountered brothers and sisters who had fallen into that same despair, he wasn't speaking down to them from a sunny, untroubled mountaintop. He was able to reach down and give them a helpful grip, because his own hands had been bloodied on those same rocks.
That is so powerful. He writes this incredible phrase, "The wheels of providence are full of eyes."
That is arresting imagery.
It really is. It means the events of our lives aren't just the blind, grinding gears of fate. Everything has a purpose. Everything is seeing and moving toward a redemptive end.
He says God makes the rich rich, so they have the specific access required to reach the wicked rich. He makes the poor poor, so they can speak the language of the wicked poor.
It makes me think of a grandmaster playing chess. For you and me, as listeners navigating our own lives, we often feel like pawns moving randomly across the board.
We really do.
We experience a sudden windfall, or a devastating bankruptcy, or a long, agonizing season of anxiety. And in the middle of it, we look up and think, this is meaningless suffering. This is just bad luck.
But Spurgeon is arguing that the master is strategically, intentionally positioning us.
Yes, he is allowing the harsh weather of life to carve us into a highly specific shape, precisely so we can catch a specific kind of fish that no one else on the board can reach.
Think about how much anxiety that theology removes from the believer. If you truly grasp that the wheels of providence are full of eyes, you don't need to panic about manufacturing ministry opportunities.
You don't need to force awkward conversations on airplanes if the Spirit isn't leading.
Exactly. Spurgeon talks about developing a sacred sensitiveness to distinct monitions, those internal, undeniable nudges from the Holy Spirit. He points to the story in Acts where the Spirit explicitly tells Philip, "Go near and join thyself to this chariot."
Philip didn't have to guess. He just had to be sensitive and obedient.
And Spurgeon contrasts this tenderly guided believer with what he calls the mulish Christian.
I love that term, the stubborn mule.
The mule that requires a bit and bridle or a sharp cut of the whip to get moving. Spurgeon is pleading with his audience, don't be the mule. Be so attuned to the master through that abiding we talked about earlier that a mere glance from his eye tells you which way to step.
If you are ready and shaped by providence, the door will open naturally.
And this framework completely flips our human insecurities upside down.
Yeah.
We look at ourselves and think, I'm inadequate, I have a stutter, I'm broken, I don't have a platform.
And Spurgeon says, perfect. That makes you the ideal instrument. To prove it, he reaches into the Old Testament. He cites Gideon, who didn't defeat the Midianite army with elite swordsmen.
No, God used a bizarre dream of a tumbling barley cake to symbolize how the weakest, most pathetic thing would smite the enemy's tent.
And he cites Samson, who didn't use a forged, polished sword to slay the Philistines, but a bleached, dry jawbone of an ass he just picked up out of the dirt.
The mechanics of this are crucial for the listener to grasp. The glaring weakness of the instrument is what highlights the sheer power of the user.
Like if a master artist paints a flawless masterpiece using a broken, fraying, cheap brush, you don't praise the brush. You stand in awe of the artist's hand.
Spurgeon is telling his listeners that your human inadequacy isn't a bug in the system, it is a required feature. It is the very mechanism that ensures the Holy Ghost gets 100% of the glory when the fish is finally caught in the net.
Okay, so we've established the sovereign machinery behind the making of a fisherman. But what does this figure full of instruction actually look like when they walk out the door? What is the practical anatomy of a fisherman?
Spurgeon breaks the metaphor down into 4 key traits, and they are incredibly gritty.
Very. The first trait is that a fisherman must be dependent and trustful.
Because fishing, by its very nature, is an act of blind faith. You are casting a net into dark, murky water. You cannot see the fish. You have no empirical proof they are even there.
He uses the example of the Mediterranean fishermen. He watched them take these massive nets, enclose acres of the sea, row their hearts out until their hands blistered, and pull the heavy net to shore, only to find what he brilliantly calls a few silvery nothings.
Barely a handful of tiny fish.
Right. And yet what do? They don't quit the profession. They row back out and cast again multiple times a day. He parallels this to the believer who must depend entirely on God for the result, casting the gospel net joyfully even when they pull up empty water for months on end.
But that dependence doesn't breed laziness. It demands the second trait, diligent and laborious.
He talks about the Dogger Bank fishermen in the North Sea. These men are up before dawn, working in freezing rain until late afternoon. Spurgeon says plainly, he does not sit in an armchair and catch fish.
They face the boisterous sea. And he quotes Ecclesiastes saying, He that regardeth the clouds will never fish.
In other words, if you wait until you feel perfectly spiritually aligned or until the cultural weather is optimal and friendly, you will never do a single piece of work for the kingdom.
It requires brute labor, yes, but also the third trait, intelligent and watchful. Fishing is an art form. It requires strategy.
Spurgeon shares an anecdote about being in Mentone, Italy. He woke up in the dead of night hearing a noise like a giant drum. He looked out his window and saw the fishermen physically beating the water with long poles to scare the crafty fish back into the net, anticipating their escape routes.
It takes wits. You have to mend the net, study the tides, and understand the psychology of the fish, or in our case, the psychology of people who are actively, creatively trying to avoid the implications of the gospel.
But the fourth trait is where I need to stop the train, because it presents a massive theological collision for me. The fourth trait is daring and successful.
Okay, successful.
Spurgeon says a fisherman must be daring, willing to be unpopular, willing to take the salt brine in his face. Fine. But then he makes a stark, absolute claim about success. He says a farmer who grows no wheat isn't a farmer.
That's a bold claim.
And a faithful minister who never converts a single soul is someone you'd want to sit under only if you didn't want to be saved. He says point blank, if the result of his life work is nil, he made a mistake when he undertook it.
Ouch.
Now, wait a minute. Given everything we just discussed about unconditional election, divine sovereignty, and the Holy Spirit being the only effectual actor, how can Spurgeon guarantee results?
It does seem contradictory.
We just talked about the Mediterranean fishermen catching silvery nothings. What about the prophet Jeremiah, the weeping prophet, who preached his heart out for decades and saw essentially zero national repentance?
Or Isaiah, who was told his preaching would only harden the hearts of his listeners.
Exactly. Is Spurgeon preaching some sort of Victorian prosperity gospel of numbers here? Because making the human instrument responsible for the sovereign result feels completely contradictory to his own theology.
That is the most difficult grinding tension in the entire text, and it's a brilliant pushback. It absolutely seems contradictory on the surface. How can the brush be blamed if the artist decides not to paint?
Exactly.
But to resolve this, we have to untangle what Spurgeon actually means by success. He is not preaching a modern church growth prosperity gospel. He is not saying that faithfulness guarantees a megachurch of 10,000 people or a national revival like Nineveh.
Okay, then what is he saying?
What he is doing is expressing an absolute bedrock faith in the specific promise of Christ in Matthew 4. Jesus said, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." It is a divine guarantee.
So the burden isn't on the preacher's charisma, it's on the integrity of Christ's word. If Christ promised it, it is a mathematical certainty it must happen in some capacity.
Exactly. Spurgeon argues, fire in the stubble will burn. It's a law of spiritual physics. If you are truly following, truly abiding, and you are truly casting the unedited, uncompromised gospel net, God promises that his word will not return void.
It might be one single soul converted over a 40-year ministry. It might be a child in your Sunday school class. But there will be some fruit.
Spurgeon's argument is diagnostic.
Right.
He is saying that if an entire lifetime yields absolutely zero fruit now, it implies a fundamental failure in the equation.
Meaning?
Either there is a failure in the following, the person isn't abiding, they lack the spirit, they are living hypocritically, or there is a failure in the net being used. They are preaching their own brand new thoughts instead of the actual remedy.
So it's not a cudgel to beat a discouraged pastor with. It's an engine light on the dashboard. If there is absolutely no fire, check to make sure you're actually holding a match and not a wet twig.
Yes. And we cannot overlook the sheer physical and emotional toll he describes in this section. He talks about being wet through 1,000 times, wearing oneself out, facing the ridicule of the age.
This is a striking, aggressive counter-narrative to the comfortable, highly intellectual armchair Christianity that so many default to today.
Spurgeon envisions a faith that leaves you exhausted, battered by the elements, but ultimately triumphant because of the Master's promise.
Which brings us to the final, masterful movement of this text. To wrap up this intense, challenging instruction manual, Spurgeon turns his attention away from the fishermen taking notes, and he speaks directly to the fish who are still swimming away in the dark water.
He addresses the unconverted, the hesitant, the broken in his audience.
Yes, he urges them to surrender and follow Christ, not just for their own safety, but so they too can be drafted into this glorious work. He uses the analogy of a runaway slave fleeing a cruel master in the middle of the night.
Which is such a potent image.
He promises that Jesus is a sanctuary city. He will never cast them out. You will never return them to their former owner. The darkness of the night, the depth of their sin is the perfect cover to run to him.
But then he lands on perhaps the most memorable, piercing claim of the entire deep dive.
Tell me.
He says, reclaimed poachers make the best gamekeepers, and saved sinners make the ablest preachers.
Oh, man. It is a stroke of absolute literary and theological brilliance. Think about the mechanics of redemption he is highlighting here. He takes the deepest shame of the sinner, the fact that they were a spiritual criminal, a poacher actively stealing from the king's estate, trespassing in the dark.
And he immediately flips it into their greatest kingdom asset.
Because who knows the woods better than the poacher? Who knows where the traps are hidden, where the fences are weak, how the shadows fall, and exactly how the criminals think?
Not the guy who grew up in the manor house reading books about forestry.
Exactly. A guy who survives in the woods knows the woods.
Their intimate, experiential knowledge of the woods of sin makes them the most highly qualified deputies to guard the estate and rescue others who are still trapped in the thicket. Spurgeon points to Saul of Tarsus as the ultimate historical proof of this.
Right. Saul was the apex poacher. He was hunting down Christians, dragging them from their homes, overseeing their executions.
But when Christ intercepts him on the Damascus road, reclaims him, and turns him into Paul the Apostle, God doesn't erase Paul's past. He redirects it.
All that zealous energy, all that intimate knowledge of the Pharisees' legalistic mindset is suddenly harnessed. The greatest poacher of the early church becomes the greatest gamekeeper to the Gentiles.
It brings this entire deep dive full circle in such a profound way. We started at the beginning with the first miracle. God looking at the chaos and the void of a dark life and saying, "Let there be light," making something beautiful out of absolute nothing.
And we end with God taking the absolute worst elements of society, the poachers, the criminals, the runaways, the broken, and not just tolerating them, but elevating them into his ablest preachers and most effective fishermen.
It is the ultimate, undeniable testament to the grace we rely on. It means that no matter how deep into the woods of sin you have wandered, no matter how many years you spent fighting the king, you haven't permanently disqualified yourself from the master's use.
In fact, under the sovereign wheels of providence, you may have just acquired the exact resume, the exact vocabulary of suffering that he is looking for to reach a part of the forest no one else on earth can navigate.
Let's synthesize this journey we've been on. For you, listener, we have explored a heavy but glorious mandate. You are not just meant to be rescued from the burning building. You are meant to put on the helmet and be an instrument of rescue for others.
We've looked at the intense, unyielding requirements of this calling, the absolute need for moral separation from the decay of the world, the daily necessity of deep apprenticeship with Jesus, and the strict rejection of those brand new thoughts that water down the only remedy that actually cures the disease.
But perfectly balanced against those heavy demands is the immense sovereign comfort that God is the one who does the actual making. He uses your lived experiences, your failures, and even your seasons in the gulf of darkness to forge you into the exact tool he requires.
Whether you feel like a tiny farthing candle just trying to keep the wind from blowing you out, or someone currently sitting on the horrible brink of depression, or even a runaway poacher who just snuck onto the king's land trembling in the dark. This historical blueprint suggests that these are the exact qualifications required for a seat in the boat.
Which is incredible news.
And that leaves us with a final thought to ponder as we wrap up this deep dive. If Charles Spurgeon is right, if the wheels of providence are truly full of eyes, and God never wastes a single tear, a single failure, or a single experience, what is the specific patch of water in your own life?
Yeah, think about that.
Perhaps the very place you experienced the most acute pain or made the most devastating mistakes, or spent the most time as a poacher that you are uniquely equipped to cast a net into right now. Keep exploring, keep holding the net, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.